Yeah, so the aim is to really kind of give an overview to begin with. We're looking to really just kind of sort of give key concepts, but importantly sort of start chipping away at the assignment booklet. So the outcomes, this is for the whole 2 sessions really. So we're going to look at the functions of the skeleton, and hopefully some of you have done a little bit of this before. We'll look at the some of the names of bones. I'm going to get you to label a skeleton just to try and get yourself sort of into it a little bit more. Sometimes it's hard to sort of break into the naming and sort of location of anatomical parts. So I'm going to sort of give you a couple of little tasks where you need to kind of refer to your gym instructor manual and then sort of fill in a little bit on your workbook. You're going to name the bones, or some of the names of the skeleton, and its 2 principal divisions. We'll cover that today. We'll consider the classification of bones. We'll also explain the structure of a long bone and stages of bone growth, but that's going to be tomorrow, as will the curves of the spine and the different types of connective tissue. So, in terms of functions of the skeleton, I guess you can ask the question, why do we have one? So, if we can just pop in the chat box, what the functions of the skeleton are, we should be able to sort of cobble together 5 or 6 as a group. So, just start writing in the chat box below. Let's see what comes in. Let's start putting it together. Okay, so I'm not overwhelmed here. Let's just try putting a couple in to start with, and then you can maybe sort of think as we go along. So number 1 is to provide this bony framework. So that's kind of a given in a way, isn't it? It is a framework. It allows your muscles to attach onto things, but also having that framework allows the organs to sit in the right position. So we've looked previously at the heart and the lungs, and we can kind of see that they're actually sort of suspended at the top, aren't they? So the skeleton provides this framework in which all our organs sit and in which all our muscles sit on top of. So it protects vital organs. So again, we saw previously the location of the heart and the lungs, and we can see that how the rib cage protects that. Maybe you can talk about other vital organs. So you think about the brain and about how the skeleton protects our brain. We can consider our spinal cord, the way that the spinal cord runs through the middle of the vertebral column. It provides a surface for muscle attachments. So muscles need to attach onto something to create levers to allow movement to happen. So muscles attach onto the surfaces via tendons. So tendons are sort of very kind of rigid cords which transmit that force through onto the bone. They produce blood cells. So when you're born, or when you're actually born, pretty much every bone in the body has the capacity to create red blood cells. So the cells themselves actually start within a section of the bone called the bone marrow, and they gradually sort of squeeze their way out that bone marrow into the circulation. So when you're born, every bone in the body can produce red blood cells, but when you reach adulthood, it's really only sort of flat bones and also the ends of bones that are nearer to your body. We call it the proximal end. So you might have a long bone such as the femur, and it's just this bit that produces red blood cells. Lots of flat bones, lots of things like the ribs can create red blood cells still. The pelvis has got quite a lot of blood cell producing properties. It stores minerals. So the body, it's quite a kind of mineral store. There's a few different types of minerals, but the main one is calcium. So calcium is the main stored mineral, and we kind of see this in later life. sometimes people lack bone mineral density, so they start to lose the calcium content of their bone, and the bone becomes quite weak. So calcium is important for lots of processes in the body, particularly things like muscle contraction need calcium to allow it to happen. When the body needs minerals, it sort of takes it out of the bone. So it's kind of important why diet includes a range of minerals and a range of nutrients to give our bones these essential parts. So we provide a bony framework, protects vital organs, a surface for muscle attachments, produces blood cells, that's red blood cells, and white blood cells come out the same place, and to store minerals. Got any more? So they provide levers for movement. So this is why, so a muscle attaching onto my lower arm pulls to create a lever to allow that movement to happen. So the whole system of movement is allowed by this system of levers. And so we're going to give you a quick quiz. So just checking who I've got come in. Okay, so quick quiz then. Right, you can do this one of two ways. Let's pop it in the chat box. Come on in. Let's see who can be fastest fingers in the chat box. Okay, quick quiz then. Number one. How many bones? Is it going to be one? No, it's not. How many bones does an adult male have, and how many bones does an adult female have? That's your question. $206. Luke, well done. Good stuff. Is that the same for both? Well, we didn't answer, but it's absolutely right. Yeah, there's no difference between the number of bones in the body between a male and a female. So well done, Luke. You were absolutely right with 206. Very good. So we have I remember had a very annoying argument with a beauty therapy teacher about how women had an extra rib, or men had an extra rib. I think it doesn't exist. It's a myth. So we all have 12 pairs of ribs. Exactly the same number of bones in the body. Where is the smallest bone in the body? Where do you find the smallest bone in the body? Quick Googling. You know, foot, not bad. Close. Well, not really. Opposite end, actually. Anyone? Yeah, well done, Caden. In the ear, yeah, muscle. We've got a little muscle. I think it's called stapedius, which almost kind of like hits on your eardrum. So smaller than a grain of sand. No, smaller than a grain of rice. So very, very small, but imagine it still has kind of muscles attached to it. Amazing sort of delicacy. Okay, so next we've got. How many bones in the foot? You've just got to take a punt. 16, 26, or 36? Well done, Ash. 26 is correct. Good. Well done. Yeah. So broken down into two bits, really, our tarsals and our metatarsals. Well, three bits, and our phalanges at the end. So we've got two slightly different bone types in our foot, which we'll look at later. So let's press on. Oh, there we are. There's our foot. Yeah. So what you can see actually here. If I just sort of annotate it. So this little line, can you see there's a slight difference in the bone types below that red line I've just drawn on? These are all called your tarsal bones. So so these are sort of slightly chunkier, short bones which absorb shock. So these are the ones that sort of absorb our shock when we land. And then if you look at the where I'm just going to put in a green line across it, you can sort of see, I'm kind of going over my, there we are. There we go, there. So that between the red and the green lines on there are those are what are called our metatarsals. So when people break bones in their foot, often it's the metatarsals which get damaged. Those sort of form that kind of bridge on top of your foot. You can see they're much longer, which allow us to create a little lever. And then those little bones at the end are our phalanges. So I'll colour those in blue. So I'm just colouring in a phalange. That's your big toe there. I've just coloured in, and then that's your little toe. I've just coloured in. So it's quite nice to sort of break it up into those those three different parts: tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges. 26 bones in all. Okay. How many pairs of ribs are there? I mentioned this earlier. How many pairs? Anyone? Come on. Yeah, well done, Troy. Good. 12 pairs of ribs. Which mineral is most common in bone? I've got two questions come up. Which is the most common mineral in bone? Is it calcium, iron, or sodium chloride? Which of those three? Well done, Caden. Calcium, good stuff. And where in the body is the ilium found? Where is the ilium? Anyone? Anyone? Right, I'm going to give it away. So this is just on the pelvis, which I'll get you to label later. Okay. What is the patella otherwise known as? More commonly known as? Anyone? Okay, someone's come in with kneecap privately. Well done. Good. So patella is kneecap. Good. Okay, last couple. What types of bone are there? So there's 5 types of bone. Can anyone name those 5 types? Quickly in the chat box, which ones we got? Just put whatever one's come into your head, put it to everyone, and we'll collect our 5 types of bone. So this is more a classification. Oh, good try, Caden. Those are joint types. So we're just looking at bone types at the minute. So it's probably a little simpler. So yeah, well done, Ash. So things like short bones. Yeah, irregular. Well done. Good. So short, irregular, long. Good. So we've got short, irregular, long. Missing 2. What do we got? What do we got up here? What protects our brain? Anyone? So it's one of the ones where I said lots of blood cells are made in them in our flat bones. So we have sort of flat bones are the type of bone we have in our skull and our ribs, and it's where our red blood cells are found. So we've got short, irregular, long, flat, and the last one is a difficult one to get. It's called a sesamoid bone, and we'll look at that in a minute. As your kneecap is a sesamoid bone, and we'll find out why it's called that in a little bit. Okay. And lastly, what is your clavicle otherwise known as? Your clavicle up in this region. Anyone? Okay. I think. Okay, I'll move things on. It's your shoulder. Yeah. Oh, it's your collarbone. So yes, it's part of your shoulder girdle, but it's your collarbone at the front here. So you can just feel it it connects onto your sternum at the top, and then joins to your kind of shoulder girdle on the outside. Good stuff. Okay, some pretty good answers there. Not a bad start. Let's move on. Okay, so we've got a picture here. I'll just take my drawings off there. What have I done? Hang on. There we go. Okay, so we've got a nice little picture of the skeleton. You have this in your manual, your electronic manual. I think it's around page, I've got it up there. Oh, it's only page 7 of your online manual. So it may be worth having that available. What you can see is, well, can you see the clavicle on this picture? You should be able to see the clavicle kind of here. So I'm just drawing it in there. There we go. Perfect. So there's the clavicle, which is part of that shoulder girdle. So the reason there's 2 bits covered in, or there's two regions covered in red, is because we start to distinguish between those different regions. So what you look at, if you look at the sort of central bit, so if you just kind of think, actually, well, what does the skull responsible for? And we kind of thought about it already, and we kind of saw it as protection. So the skull is about protection, and it protects the brain. Then if you work all the way down, that vertebral column, what does the vertebral column protect? Yeah, it protects the brain. And then if we take all the rest in here, and we looked previously and we saw the ribs and the sternum protect the lungs and the heart. So often we think of a kind of a central portion of the skeleton being about protection. It's a bit more complicated than that, but on a sort of, on a very kind of basic level, we'll consider that. So we talk about that as being our axial skeleton. So the axial skeleton contains the skull, the vertebral column, the rib cage, and it's there to really protect those vital organs. Now, if you then look at what's in red, you can see they're much longer, sort of, I guess, much longer bones. We have our hands at the ends of our arms. We have our feet at the ends of our legs. They're much more responsible for moving and grasping and our kind of locomotion. So this is called our appendicular skeleton. It kind of hangs off the axial skeleton. It's responsible for moving and grasping, and I guess we call it locomotion, movement, walking. So we kind of draw this relatively simple distinction between the two. So it's basically axial is skull, rib cage, spine, appendicular is everything else. So I'm just going to get rid of my annotation. Okay, so what I'm going to get you to do now, I want you to sort of start kind of finding your way into these your workbooks, really. So what you'll find on page 12 of your candidate workbook, so that's this. You've got a little picture of a skeleton like this. So what I'd like you to do is to fill in the following bones. So first of all, I want you to fill in the ulna and the radius, and then the femur, and then the tibia, and then the fibula. So that's your job. So if you don't know where they are, I want you to look in your manual. So this should take maybe about 5 minutes, because you're going to need to sort of get out your candidate workbook, you're going to need to find those bones. And if you don't know immediately where they are, you're going to need to look in your gym instructor manual. So that's your job. I'm going to pause me for 5 minutes and let you get on with that. But I want you to start sort of finding your way in. Now, one thing I would say is your pictures are pretty bad. Remember, an arm, as I hold it like this, the radius is on the outside. So your ulna is on the inside. The picture you have has it sort of being labeled about here. So I just want you to be aware. You might need to double check. You're going to need to draw in, you're going to need to sort of change one of the lines to show radius. It's a pretty rubbish picture you've got, but you're going to have to do your best. So there's your 5 bones. If you could just do that for me quickly, that should now, I think, it take about 3 or 4 minutes actually. So if you can get on with that, any problems, just pop it in the chat box. So hopefully you managed to get that. Let's give a couple more taskettes. So I guess the question I ask is, what do these bones have in common? What's common to all those bones? Ulnar, radius, femur, tibia, fibula. There's probably 2 things we can say quite easily to begin with. So just get me some ideas in the chat box, please. What do they all have in common? So anyone? Okay, well, the thing we were sort of honing in on was number 1, that they're all part of the appendicular skeleton. So we make that distinction between the axial and appendicular skeleton. So they're going to be involved in sort of grasping, moving. So there are sort of limbs that are hanging off of our axial skeleton. So they're all appendicular bones. They're also all long bones, aren't they? So they're sort of much longer than they are short. So create long levers to allow us to, again, reach out or move ourselves. So next question. Now, what I'd like you to do, you need to put these ones in yourself. So I want you to just go to your workbook, and I want you to draw a line labeling the clavicle and the scapula. So what you're going to have to do is something a bit like this. So just sort of put a line on that clavicle, or we'll go the other way around actually. Hang on, let me just clear that. So yeah, look a bit more like this. Okay, so you can do that, and then just put a text box just saying clavicle, and then your scapula, you're going to need to sort of almost kind of show in there where it's going. Okay, so just draw a line labeling your clavicle and scapula. Whilst you're here and looking at it, I'll try and find you some other bones that are a nightmare on your diagrams. Okay, so hopefully you've got. So just to resume the recording. So on the bottom on the leg, I've drawn an arrow. Hopefully you've all got this one right. What does that arrow point towards? What bone does that point towards? What have you got in your answers? Someone put in the chat box what you've got. Anyone? So you should have the bigger bone. Yeah, well done, Caden. Good. So that's the tibia. Perfect. So that must mean the other one is going to be the fibula on the outside. So which one do people break more often? Which one's the most commonly of those bones broken? You can sort of see why it might be. So you've got the fibula on the outside. Here we go. Yeah. So the fibula is the one that's broken most commonly. What you find actually is a lot of people kind of break this area down here. Oh, it's probably not the best color to choose, but yeah, it's a very sort of commonly damaged area, or kind of sort of a classic kind of lower leg break. The fibula is just much thinner. Although the tibia is thicker because it bears all the weight, the tibia is a little bit more involved in rotation. So when we rotate and someone sort of kicks us, it's really vulnerable to damage. So that's great. Let me just clear that off. I've got another question on here. Oh, the last one. Oh yeah, you're going to label the ilium, which is on the pelvic girdle. Now, your picture is imperfect. Who would have believed? So what I'm going to get you to do is, well, what you can see, it's on the right hand side. You've got a picture where your diagram, I'll try to do it on the same side that you have. It kind of goes to there. If you just extend that line in a little bit more, you'll find the ilium. So if you can just put that in there, and that's part of the pelvic girdle. So again, part of the appendicular skeleton. So if you just label it the ilium, and then underneath it, what you'll see, there's a line that sort of does that. Kind of does that. Now, so if this is the ilium, this one below, what I want you to do is actually just extend that line. So it actually goes in another sort of 3 or 4, well, I want you to put it in so it goes another sort of 4 or 5 millimeters. So what I want you to do is just kind of extend that bottom line so it goes as far as me putting that blue line in, okay? And you could label that, you've got one of 2 options really. So I think what's best to label it as. So you've labeled the ilium, just label the bottom one. It's kind of the tibia where it is actually. Just extend that line. And I want you to label that as, just that the pelvic girdle is fine. Okay. So you're starting to build up your picture. I'll just make sure you're there or thereabouts. So you've got a few bits and pieces to have filled in. We'll return to that in a short while. So let me just clear all these pictures off. There we go. And crack on. Okay, so I've tried to kind of introduce you to a couple of bits of terminology so far. I think some of you sort of know it fairly well already. So I'll try and be sort of fairly brief with this. So what we've got here is different classifications of bone. So we've got those 5 sorts of classifications here. We've got long, which we've talked about with respect to the appendicular skeleton. So you've got mostly in our appendicular skeleton, they create long levers to allow movement. We've also got little short bones. So you can see short bones. So we can have them in carpals, which I'm just sort of outlining here. So at the base of our wrist, we've got little short bones, and they kind of attach on to these much longer bones we've got attached on the end. We have flat bones. So the The scapula is often called a flat bone. My drawing doesn't work at the minute. So it's very flat to allow broad muscle attachment. We have flat bones in our skull to provide protection. We have flat bones in our ribs to protect as well. We have irregular bones, which we'll look at in a minute. And we've also got these sesamoid bones like our kneecap, again, which we'll go through in a second. So you'll be asked to describe each of these classifications and give some examples. I've sent you this presentation. So we'll just go through it sort of fairly quickly, but hopefully enough so you get a nice grasp of that concept. So here's long bones. So long bones act as levers. They help us reach, i.e. our arms, or move, i.e. our legs. So this person in the middle is just walking, and you can see how nice long levers allow the sort of long stride that she has. In my arms, the fact that I've got a big humerus and a big radius and ulna allows me to reach and grasp. So for our survival, it's really effective. It's really essential for our movement and our kind of our everyday living. So short bones. I've got a couple of pictures of short bones at the bottom. So if you look at the short bones, you've got, again, where I sort of drew that line across the foot earlier. Everything back from here, where I've just drawn in that red line, everything that side is a short bone. So a lot of these are about absorbing shock. So when we land on our heel, which is called our calcaneus, and that's a sort of quite a heavy load-bearing bone. So it's the sort of thing that people get stress fractures in if they sort of land repeatedly in there. So that's where we sort of absorb that initial load. And as our foot lands, it sort of rolls through those short bones and then onto the long levers that spring us off the other side. So our foot has a combination of short bones to absorb shock. These are the calcaneus and the other tarsal bones. So it lands, and then as it rolls through onto our metatarsals, it creates a nice spring to allow us to sort of move, to create big, long movement levers. So long bones act as levers. They help us reach or move, and short bones in the feet, i.e. the tarsals, help us absorb shock. And we have other short bones in our wrist, which are, I don't know, they kind of create a sort of stable base to allow our grasping hands. Okay, let me just clear that off. So here we've just got a nice picture of our skull. So I want us to think of the cranium. I'll do my terrible hair. The cranium is these bits which are the flat bones. The front, our face, is part of our facial, what are called facial bones, and they're a little bit different. These ones on the top, the ones that are coloured in on your diagram here, are our flat bones. So they, when we're born, we kind of have this little squashy bit in our head. So when we're growing, those flat bones are sort of little blobs of cartilage, and they never quite fully develop into sort of calcium-filled bone when we're born. So it takes a few months for them to kind of fuse together to create this sort of rigid structure that's allowed to protect our brain. So they're flat, they're very broad, they protect. We also have flat bones in our ribs. So here we've got someone getting hit in their ribs. So the ribs sort of create, again, a sort of bony framework around our lungs and heart to kind of give it that extra layer of protection. So if you look on here, we'll look at ribs later, but what you can see is that at the front, we've got our sternum. Well, the whole thing is our sternum here. But can you count how many ribs there attach directly into that sternum? How many of the ribs attach directly onto that sternum? you can kind of count through. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll count that as a 7th on the bottom. And then we've got 1, which attaches to the one above it. We've got 2 attaching to the one above it, and then 3 that attach to the one above it. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 ribs. And that means we've got 2 little fellas down here that don't attach to anything. So they're called what are called floating ribs. So we have a few ribs which have a direct attachment to our sternum, and then we have ones that attach to the bone below, and then we have what are called floating ribs, these 2 at the bottom. But we have 12 ribs, 1 effectively for each vertebrae. So here we've got irregular bones. So irregular bones have specialist, unique shapes. So if you look at this rather horrible picture of a skull, what you can see, we looked at, do you remember when we did the respiratory system? And I talked a little bit about the shelves in our nose. If you look, I'm just going to sort of outline it in red there. If you look at the inside of our nose, can you see how it kind of creates almost like, so we've got a little partition down the middle called our septum. So that means as air comes into your nose, it goes kind of either side, left and right. And then each of those sides is kind of on sort of 3 layers. So it means that the air has a better chance of passing by a surface. So our nose has got quite a specialist bony structure, which isn't repeated elsewhere in the body. And also you can see that socket where our eye is kind of formed. And if you look kind of deep into that eye, you can see, I'm just popping it in red here. It's difficult to pick out actually. Those little holes in the back, they carry the nerves that supply your eye. So the eye is just a sort of almost kind of a receptacle for light. So light changes do things to your eyes, and they stimulate nerves which take those signals all the way back into your brain. So to create all these little holes and little cavities, you need very specialist sort of weird shaped bones. So our irregular bones are bones that are specialist, unique shapes, which aren't really repeated anywhere else in the body. So vertebrae are irregular bones. We'll do a little bit more on them in a future session. But what you can see here is each vertebrae is unique. So if you just count our vertebrae, we've got 7 at the top. Our cervical vertebrae is kind of here up. This is what our head balances on top of. We've got our thoracic vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, remember 1 for each rib. And then we've got our 5 lumbar vertebrae. So just look at the difference between the vertebrae. What do you notice difference between the lumbar and the cervical vertebrae? What can you see in terms of differences? So just pop in the chat box anything that you see. Anyone? Right, I'm going to put my answer in there, speed it up. Yeah, good, Jace. Yeah, putting lumbar vertebrae further apart. Yeah, that's quite interesting actually. Yeah, because on the picture, what we've got here is you can see so the body is, the front is that way. I'll just annotate so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. But if you look in, oh, that's a terrible picture, the wrong one. Let me just do a better one. There we go. What you can see here is there's a gap. So in there, we'd normally have the intervertebral disc. So this sort of sheet of cartilage or disc of cartilage that allows kind of a little bit of shock absorption. So number one, the lumbar vertebrae have a much bigger disc, and you sort of aware of this. People talk about having slip discs and prolapse discs and the like, and they're more common in the lumbar spine. That's not to say you don't get them in the cervical spine, and you very rarely get them in the thoracic spine. As problems with them, you have discs between each vertebrae. So you have great big discs in the lumbar spine. You can also see when you actually look at the size of that vertebral body. So the vertebral body, the main sort of weight absorbing part of that bone, is much bigger because it has to absorb more shock. Now, if you look at the cervical spine, this area up here, they're much smaller, so they don't have so much shock to absorb, and they're a bit more mobile. So if you think about our neck, we have to move from side to side, up and down. So it's just a little bit smaller, a little bit more mobile, and a bit more delicate in a way. This is why neck injuries are treated with such caution when people injure themselves on the sports field. Now, the common thing they all have, so what I was talking about these vertebral bodies is that bit there. So that vertebral body is the sort of load-bearing area. And I'm just going to put in a little picture in another color. I'll just use green to show a space. So what goes in that space there, in that green one there, called the foramen? What goes in there? The one I've just put that green line into. Anyone? Anyone in the chat box? I'll color it in. There we go. This area here, I'm just doing green. So what travels in there? This green area here. Someone help me out. There we are. All that lovely coloring. Okay, so what you should see is that space in the middle is where your spinal cord runs. So the spinal cord attaches to the base of your brain, and it runs all the way down your vertebral column. So the whole vertebral column is really a way of kind of protecting that vertebral column and allowing it to also communicate with the muscles and the organs of our body. So vertebrae are irregular, each vertebrae is unique. The vertebrae house and protect the spinal cord. So you can see it sort of sits in that space behind behind those vertebral bodies. So if I drew a picture in a sort of a red color, what you'd see is actually the spinal cord itself actually sort of runs a little bit, well, it goes directly behind those vertebral bodies. So the vertebrae are separated by intervertebral discs. So if you were just drawing them in orange here, you'd find intervertebral discs there and there. That's the wrong size, isn't it, really, that picture? There we go, that's better. So the vertebral discs sit between each vertebrae, and as I color in the lumbar ones, you can see I need a little bit more pen, so they're much bigger down the bottom. There are different regions of the vertebral column. So we've got our cervical at the top here, we have our thoracic region there, and we have our lumbar region there. So your question at the bottom to answer now is which other bones actually attach onto the spine? So I just want you to pop in the chat box which bones you think you can think of that attach onto the spine. So let's just load up the chat box. So just have a think on that for a minute. So yeah, you have a few good ideas come in. So the hip bone, so we sort of called it the ilium. As you travel up the spine, you can see the rib cage attaches onto the vertebral column, and then really only the skull at the back, I think we can consider as being direct attachments. So good, well done. Let me just clear off these drawings. So I talked a little bit about these sesamoid bones. This is on the picture on the left-hand side is a knee. Can you tell if it's the left or right knee? Left or right? Left or right? What's it going to be? Anyone? Okay, so it is the it's going to be a right knee, isn't it? So yeah, well done, Jace. Yeah, so it's a right knee. So you can see the fibula on the outside. The bits in white are all sort of a combination of tendons and ligaments. So in our knee, we have these ligaments called the collateral ligaments on the outside. Inside, we have a cruciate or pair of cruciate ligaments, which stop the knee moving forward and backwards. But here, what we've got is the patella, which is a sesamoid bone. So what you see, what you can see in that is what it kind of does is it blends the quadricep muscles. So all the quadricep muscles kind of attach into the tendon that surrounds that patella. So you've got the quadriceps sort of pull. So 4 quadriceps all pull on that same tendon, that same bone. The patella itself sits deep inside that tendon, and it means that it kind of glides with the surface underneath. So the quadriceps pull up and they transmit their force via that tendon onto the tibia underneath. What's that symbol? And so the reason it was called a sesamoid bone is because it's kind of all encased in these tendons. And so when early anatomists found this bone, they basically sort of used to cut up anyone that had died, or often sort of prisoners that had been executed, and thought they need to find out more about the body, so they'd cut them up. And they came across these bones where or these sort of sections where they cut them, and then they kind of open them up, and it would look like a sesame seed, because inside there'd be this sort of shiny white bone, and they said, well, it looks like a sesame seed. So sesamoid bones are called that because they look a bit like a sesame seed when they were sort of cut open. You've only got a couple more in your body. You've got one underneath your big toe, which sometimes gets inflamed and kind of causes a really sharp pain. And I think you've got one in your thumb as well, kind of just under there. So they just sort of transmit force. Someone's asked what is your ACL? Well, it's difficult to show on this picture actually, but so in your knee, what you have is you have sort of ligaments on the outside called your collateral ligaments, and then if this was your tibia and that was forward, you have your femur on top. So the ACL connects the femur up here onto the tibia underneath. So it means that they don't move in that direction. So if you don't have an ACL, your tibia kind of moves like that on that bottom, on that lower leg. So the cruciate ligaments stop movement kind of forward and backwards of that tibia on the femur. So they're called a cruciate because the ligaments kind of cross over. So, I've got a typo on my slide as well. I do apologise. Okay, So here is your task. I'm going to give you this task just to get into the habit of looking at bones and seeing differences. I want you to spot 3 differences in bone types between humans on the left-hand side and gorillas on the right-hand side. I think it's often quite interesting to compare humans to animals because we have real similarities in our skeletons. And then there's some things that are really, really different, which kind of gives you a sort of indication about the way that different animals use bones differently. And gorillas are even more interesting because we share such similar anatomy, such sort of such as kind of the same parts but different sizes, different thickness. So what I want you to do is look at this, and I want you to see if you can spot 3 differences and explain them using the terminology we've used so far. So thinking about short bones, long bones, thinking about flat bones, just using very specific terminology to describe particular bones that are different. So to start you off, I will look at, say, let's have a look at, I'll annotate it so you can see the sort of thing I want from you. So let's have a look at the, oh, picture's the wrong way around. So yeah, someone said skull size. This is good. Arm length. Have a look at which arm length and try and think why. So here I've got a picture of the ilium, or part of the pelvic girdle, and the ilium is much taller and much flatter. So that's number 1. So let's get some ideas. Get 3 if you've all got 3. See if you can get more. I think we can get up to about 5 good ones in here. So let's just write into the chat box what you see, and then we'll kind of discuss it in the group. Okay, that's your job for a couple of minutes. I want to get on with the rest of it fairly quickly. Recording. Yeah. So what we've got then? Let's see what people have written in. There's some nice ideas coming in already. I think it's useful to sort of look at these. So ribs are a lot bigger on gorillas. They absolutely are. Why is this? Why do we think ribs have got such a much bigger rib cage? So can you see this on the bottom? Anyone? So you can see how that rib cage kind of flares out, can't you? A little bit of it is related actually. Someone put about how the jaw is much thicker. So if you look on the jaw, this is called the mandible. The jaw is much thicker, so it houses really powerful muscles, and they have to chew through really sort of fibrous kind of bits of tree and whatever gorillas eat. So much more sort of fibrous vegetation. So this means they eat a lot of food, but it's a lot of food that's very difficult to digest, very sort of fibrous, and stuff that we'd kind of struggle to eat. They have a really long digestive system to allow that difficult to digest food to break down. So that kind of explains a bit of that sort of broad chestedness. It also houses a lot of much more powerful muscles. So people mentioned if we just compare, let's just have a look at let's just kind of compare the 2. So you can see the humerus and also actually the lower arm bones are much longer on the gorilla, because that's where they sort of move from. So they sort of stand on their kind of haunches, and they move with their arms. So they have these big muscle attachments on the top of their body to allow that to be their long lever. Where you can see this as well, or where you can contrast, is also the size of our scapulars. So you can see gorillas have got much bigger shoulder blades, so their scapulars are much larger because they have these big old muscles that need to propel them along. You know, where they're reaching up and grasping, you know, they have to be really strong powerful muscles, which need a much thicker attachment. So you can see on us, I think someone said that our femurs are much, much longer than gorillas, because that's our lever for movement. That's our sort of our sort of locomotion, if you like. So I think most people got most things, actually. It's some pretty good ideas. So well done all. So yeah, this is just the sort of summary. So, scapulas are much larger in gorillas because they have these big muscle attachments. Humans have much longer femurs, anterior and fibulas. Gorillas have a longer humerus. Again, this is about their sort of need to propel themselves. You can see that chap on the bottom right. He's got this huge muscular torso, and this is where he sort of moves, but also sort of where they'll grasp and sort of rip their food out from. Gorillas have a much straighter spine, so they don't spend so much time directly upright. So our spine curves help us to absorb that gravity stress, if you like. Gorillas have a much larger, powerful jaw, this mandible, to help them chew, and then the lower ribs on a gorilla are much more flared because they've got a much longer sort of digestive tract to kind of break through all this sort of very fibrous food that they take in. So there. Okay, now I'm just debating. I'm going to do one more thing very quickly. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to give you the work before we move on. So what I'd like you to do is this. First of all, I think we've done quite a lot. So I think we should take a quick 10-minute break, and then I'm going to get you to return and complete some work for me afterwards. So if you're happy, let's just grab ourselves a quick break, and then we'll return immediately afterwards. Okay. So before we broke, I just gave the opportunity to look at one of these kind of pictures, just to try and get comfortable with looking at the difference in bones, really. So and considering the differences in bone type. So far we've looked at the skeleton as a whole. We've divided it into the appendicular and the axial skeleton. We've also considered the different bone types. So we've looked at the appendicular skeleton, and we've looked at that most of that is kind of those long bones, which are about creating long levers for movement. But there's also some short bones to create a sort of stable base for the wrist, and also provide that sort of shock absorption in the ankle, really, in the ankle and the foot. We kind of looked at our flat bones. We kind of looked at flat bones from a kind of protection perspective. So in the skull, they protect the brain. In the chest, they protect the ribs, protect the heart and the lungs. The sternum as well protects the heart. But they can also be kind of broad muscle attachment. So on our gorilla, we saw that we kind of classify the scapula as a flat bone. And so on gorillas, it's really big because it's a big muscle attachment. On us, it's still a broad muscle attachment for our shoulder girdle. So we've also got the pelvis, which is a kind of the ilium, which is kind of a flat bone, again, which is a broad muscle attachment. We looked also at sesamoid bone. So we looked at the idea of it looking like a sesame seed to early anatomists, sort of cutting open all these surrounding tendons and sort of seeing this sort of shiny white bone in the middle. And then we looked also a bit at irregular bones like the facial bones and the vertebrae. So what I want you to do now in your workbooks is a very long and complicated task. I want you to do a written task for me instead. So I need you to write these questions down, but they need to be in a form that you can submit as a formal piece of assessed work. So a fresh sheet of A4 paper if you're writing, or if you're word processing, I need the details very clearly on the work that you're going to submit. So what I've got for you is we're not going to do that, is this. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to create or sort of get your piece of A4 paper, and all you're going to do is at the top, you're going to write this information. So you're going to write your name, you're going to write that it's Unit 1 and it's Part 3, skeletal system. You could even add that too. Then you're going to do 3 questions for me. Now, what I want you to do now is complete 3.1 and 3.3. I'll try and go through the labeling with you in the next slide, just because there's some of the drawings are awful, and I want you to just sort of show exactly what's connecting to where. So the way it's going to look, you're going to do 3.1, a written answer. You're going to finally complete the labeling of the skeleton that's in your workbooks, and then you're going to do a written answer for 3.3. So if you could write exactly that, 3.1, and then that question, and then I want your answer to follow. So the first one, you're going to describe the basic functions of the skeleton. So those are those 5 we started with. So things like red blood cell production, creating a bony framework for the body, to provide an attachment for muscles, movement. So there's a really nice section in your workbook, and I want you to just come up in your own words with a really basic description. Don't write an essay on it, but but it needs to be about a line or more for each section. You're then going to write the 3.3 answer, and you're going to identify the different classifications of bone, giving examples for each. So remember, this is our long, short, flat, irregular sesamoid. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to give you, I don't think that's that big a task actually. I'm going to give you 15 minutes to do those 2 written tasks. And then what I'll do, I'll outline a couple that you'll struggle with on the diagram, and you can do that in the time you get after this session. And then I'm going to go through a little bit of work from yesterday. So if we just work on that now, so take 15 minutes out, I'll put a timer on. Let's see if you can get it done inside that time. Make sure you've written those questions out and you've got your sheet organized nicely. So I'll shut up and let you get on with that, and I'll keep this up on the screen. Okay, so you're just doing 3.1 and 3.2, but it needs to be written on a sheet with your name, date, Unit 1, Part 3, or word processed with that same format. Okay, so I'll leave you to it. Any problems or any questions, just pop them in the chat box, but I'll just let you get on with that. Okay, good luck.